I'm still struggling with Citizens United. I was looking last night at the super PACs had to disclose. They disclose every quarter, every 3 months. The super PACs had to disclose by the 1st of February who their contributors were. And a lot of it's online. You can look at opensecrets.org, or the New York Times website has a more detailed listing of who contributed to these super PACs. And it's chilling reading to see the amount of money that these plutocrats are putting into the political campaigns this year, using the mechanism of the super PACs. And I started out the discussion of Citizens United by pointing out that the Supreme Court, in the Citizens United case, had not mentioned super PACs. And I think that's because there weren't any before Citizens United, and that when the decision came down, some astute campaign finance wizards and their lawyers sat down and figured out, well, if corporations can use their money, unlimited amounts of money, to support political candidates without directly contributing to the candidate's campaign, why don't we set up an organization that facilitates that? And so they set up super PACs, which are now swallowing the whole thing. The super PACs are spending more money in campaigns than the candidates themselves by a factor of 2 or 3 or 4 to 1. And I think that phenomenon was unknown to the Supreme Court. I don't think the court realized when they were deciding Citizens United that super PACs would be the result of their effort. That is, they thought that they were liberating corporations to take out television ads using their own money in support or against a candidate. And that's what we'd see. And of course, we haven't seen that at all. Instead, we see what the super PACs are doing. And I think that was an unintended consequence of the Supreme Court's decision. Those of you who are conspiracy-minded might think, that the 5 conservative justices on the court figured this out and then wrote this decision in a way that disguised what their true agenda was. But I don't think they could see it coming. And yet it has dramatically altered the political landscape. Whether it opens up a new area for regulation of campaign finance remains to be seen. It's certainly not going to happen this year. The 2012 elections, President and House of Representatives and Senate, are going to be completely overwhelmed with super PAC money, and there won't be any change in that this year. Okay, that's the last thing I want to say about Citizens United. Any lingering questions, confusions that we ought to clear up right here and now? Okay, so we'll move on to a case that's almost 30 years old now, 1984 case, the Clark case, that has suddenly this year become much more relevant. It was somewhat of a relic that nobody paid much attention to, and of course it involved the encampment in Washington, where homeless advocates wanted to set up tents and occupy the mall. And 1984 was the decision. I don't know when the events occurred. A little bit before that. I think this picture is probably not of that homeless encampment because it didn't happen, but rather I think this was probably a picture of the Poor People's Campaign that was inspired by Martin Luther King back in the late 60s. But it looks like what the homeless encampment would have looked like. And the case is between the National Park Service and the organization organizing the protest on behalf of homeless people. Who won the case? The Park Service, the government, won the case. And what was the court's reasoning?
It wasn't the conduct wasn't in a way. We figured the conduct is speech.
Right. So the court decided that the Park Service did not violate the First Amendment by prohibiting the protest because it was conduct?
Yeah, but still, there are other ways of letting protesters in, but they can
What did the court have to say about whether it's speech or conduct?
I think they said it's expression. Like they were expressing something. But they said it wasn't like they were prohibiting them from camping there because of that specific movement. These are the rules, and this is a neutral decision. It has nothing to do with the concept.
Yeah, they actually didn't decide whether putting up tents and sleeping in them was speech. They assumed that it was. We will assume for the purpose of this decision that this conduct is expressive and can be considered speech. The same way that Greta Thunberg's raising the flag was expressive conduct, comprehended within the protection for speech. Do you agree with the result of the case? Did the court come out right? That the protest was properly prohibited, right? Everybody agree? Nobody will stand up for the demonstrators? Yeah.
I agreed until the last session they pointed out that they are prohibited from protesting other forms they can afford other forms of publication because of the homeless. And it was the fact of demonstrating how many people are homeless by putting the Boulder Road sit out in the winter in the cold because they don't have kids up. And that manner that is a lot to be captured in the report.
And you were persuaded because it tugged at your heartstrings. You thought of those people shivering out.
A lot of them, like local things can't afford to publish like their voice in newspapers. That was basically
And how does that relate to the court's analysis?
because one of the restrictions or thinking about is whether there are other means of speech besides if they don't have this, we still have to win.
Right. It's funny, isn't it? When you read these decisions, you read the majority opinion, yes, it seems right, quite logical. Then you read the dissent and say, whoops. Yeah?
That just didn't make sense to me because they say that there's something expressive, and then they say, well, yes, the time, place, and manner restrictions have the purpose and direct effect of limiting expression, but are nevertheless valid. I just don't understand how you go from, okay, it's expressive speech protected by the First Amendment, but because we say so it's not protected. It just seems like, okay, what's the point of the First Amendment if you're going to apply it kind of arbitrarily?
Well, it actually does make sense, but I'm not sure that I can explain it. Let me try. The speech in question is not in an unprotected category. It's protected. So presumptively protected. Any speech that doesn't fall within one of those taboo categories, obscenity, libel, and so on, is presumptively protected. Then the next step is, if the government attempts to restrict the speech based on its content, we've been over this before, if the restriction is content-based, then that restriction is presumptively unconstitutional, and the government has to establish two things in order for the restriction to survive strict scrutiny. One, the restriction serves a compelling government interest, and two, it does so, the restriction is narrowly tailored to serve that interest. That's if government is attempting to restrict speech based on its content. But even if it's not content-based, if there's a restriction on speech that is not in an unprotected category, the government is still allowed, under the time, place, and manner doctrine, to restrict the speech, if it can jump through the hoops required by that doctrine. This decision was written by Justice Byron White, who's not a First Amendment-friendly justice at the time, and the decision lays out for us the prescriptions, as you put it, the factors that determine whether a time, place, and manner restriction is valid. The restriction cannot be aimed at the content of the speech. It has to be content neutral. That is, government is not singling out this kind of speech on this subject, for restriction. It's a restriction that applies to any speech and all speech. It's content neutral. Gotcha.
Yeah, because even when we talk about it, the regulation was on sleep in the park, not speech in the park. And so, it would have been fine if they stayed out there and then didn't sleep there. I mean, obviously their point was to sleep, you know.
Right.
They also gave them the opportunity to go to the campgrounds, because there were campgrounds. They could have.
Well, there are no campgrounds on the mall, and there are no campgrounds in Lafayette Park. But there are campgrounds in national parks. I mean, you go to Yosemite, you can go to the campground. The national park permits campgrounds, permits camping, sleeping, in tents, in a lot of national parks, but not in those two. Yeah.
Two, they have to satisfy all three.
Yes.
So if one's not satisfied,
Then the government loses. Then it's not a valid time, place, and manner restriction. No?
The government, the decision was talking about how they had the alternative channel, and that was like to go to a different campground, and they could be there all day and night, but that's not really an alternative channel. They're not in the highly publicized place where you can have all the people there at the same time. You can't stay up 24 hours, right? Like they're saying, like, you have a day and night vigil. If you're gonna sleep, you have to leave.
Right.
But that means that half people.
You could do a tag team. Somebody do it in shifts.
You don't have your restricted number. Like, so that's kind of invalid.
Well, the leaving open alternative channels of communication is one of the factors. And what's Justice White have to say about that? Robert? Yeah, but Have you?
I think it is content neutral in the fact that they even issued a permit for demonstrators to be there. It's just that there's sometimes where speaking was prohibited. Maybe it is in the government's interest to protect the pristine image of the park, but that's not necessarily to say that means we'll allow like people there to demonstrate. I think that is the government interest to keep like the image of the park to be pristine. I think the image of like protesters at a place is different from the image of like people sleeping at a place. Even though like the sleeping is to show the like homelessness, and I feel like there are other ways to show that, for example, the signs, like have like medical. I don't know. I just don't.
You're saying alternative channels of communication? Is that what
I
you're?
don't think sleeping is the only communication that happens.
Isn't that one of Justice White's points, that there are alternative channels of communication, and therefore this factor is satisfied? And what are those alternative channels?
Well, I don't think just say this instead of medical different signs, but I think there are other ways of communicating with homelessness other than sleeping in a place.
Right, and that's certainly what Justice White thinks, that there's no, what does he say, there's no, the plight of the homeless could be communicated in other ways. The regulation left the demonstration intact, so they could be there, they could pitch their tents, with its symbolic city signs and the presence of those who were willing to take their turns in day and night vigil. And there was no barrier on their delivering to the media or to the public their message. So there were, in fact, other channels open to communicate the message. No?
I think the problem is though they're not really equivalent channels. It's really difficult to have equivalent channels because, like I said before, you want to have all the people there at the same time around the clock, and people can actually live, and that's what they're not kind of necessary in this case to allow this.
Yeah, aren't you saying you want the most effective way to communicate the message? Are you entitled to the most effective way, regardless of the government's interest in managing the parks?
Not always, but in this case, I mean, potentially you could go camp elsewhere, but that would make it less effective. In fact, you can do that elsewhere, I guess, to be able to do it in this national park. Because no matter what you do, you can't have it effect.
Jen?
But I mean, that's sort of getting to the heart of the idea of the time, place, and manner restriction. Is the government can say, in this place, there's no sleeping after 11 on the park. Doesn't matter if you're an MC or a basketball or if you're free people, you can't be zero over.
Yeah, next to you.
The government's interest is the public safety.
Tell us about Lafayette Park and the mall as campsites. Right. And are the homeless people permitted to sleep on a bench in Lafayette Park or on the mall?
I don't think so. I've never really.
The Park Service rangers chase them off? Mhm. Yeah.
I have one more question. Because there were designated campsites, one, did it cost money to stay there? And two, could they physically hold that many people? Because I wonder, they say that they couldn't, assuming they didn't have the money to seek other media forms of publication, was there a physical space they could have chosen instead?
In the District of Columbia? I don't know, ask your neighbor. Matt, is there a national park site, campsite somewhere in Washington? I don't think there's anything, no. You'd have to go to the Great Smoky Mountains National Park or...
I feel like anywhere they go, their speech would be restricted because it's actually their own kind of speech that is worried about how much their rights. And I don't have to give them like, get over here, but go over there, because they know over there.
Yeah. Well, according to Justice White, all three of the factors were met. Content neutral. It doesn't matter what the message was. What animated the Park Service was not the message. You might be skeptical of that. You might say, oh, if it had been this is during the Reagan administration, if it had been a rally to express support for President Reagan's administration and they wanted to sleep overnight, they might not have been so upset. But in fact, the restriction on sleeping was content neutral. And according to White, there were open alternative channels of communication. And the guts of the decision was that this regulation against sleeping was in fact narrowly tailored to serve the government's interest. The government's interest, as I understand it, is keeping the park pristine, or keeping the park available for use by the hundreds of thousands of people who live in D.C. or visit D.C. and want to enjoy those parks. Lafayette Park, right adjacent to the White House, and the mall running between, is it the Jefferson Memorial now, or the Lincoln Memorial? Lincoln Memorial and the Capitol. You can sort of get the sense that judges probably feel a little uncomfortable with the idea of this ragtag group out there defacing visually, aesthetically, defacing these national monuments. Maybe that animated them, but they got 7 votes on the court. But what the purpose of this, of looking at this case now, is twofold. One, it's to show you what the time, place, and manner rules are, and second, to see whether the Clark case can serve as a precedent for dealing with the issues in 2012 about involving the Occupy movement. Chief Justice Berger, who, as I said, is usually pro-government and always gives the government the benefit of the doubt in First Amendment cases, in his brief concurring opinion, says this is not speech, should not be treated as speech at all. It's purely conduct, not speech. And we'll encounter that. I hesitate to say dichotomy because that's a word they use in college, right? You keep talking about dichotomy. I mean, there's a difference between speech, which is protected by the First Amendment, and conduct, which is not, except when it's expressive conduct that should be treated as speech. But certainly Chief Justice Berger was not willing to entertain that at all. And then you have this persuasive, dissent by Thurgood Marshall, joined by William Brennan, 2 lions of the First Amendment, who think that the court got it wrong. And what was it that persuaded you about the dissent when you got it, when you got to it, that brought you around? That there were no, in fact, the alternative channels of communication of this message about homeless people didn't exist, or was it something else?
And then I also got this whole show with saying, mentioning on the public safety and sanitation issue, the second part of the sentence where they were saying that it was established in the park, but they never say exactly how. So I thought, okay, that made a good point, but then I guess the more of this was kind of more on this.
Yeah, maybe you can help me understand. I don't understand. He says that the court, by assuming that sleeping is speech, by making that assumption, the court downplayed the significance of what these demonstrators were intending to do and what they wanted to get across. And I don't understand what he was getting at there. Do you, John?
No, I mean, was he saying that he would rather them come to a conclusion for a specific reason why it was good, and that may have the outcome of their overall decision?
That's what he's saying, but I don't get the connection there. That if they have to look very carefully at what the message was and how these folks wanted to get it out there, then the court would have decided that the manner of communicating was the only way to do it. I think that's where he's going. No?
I interpreted the meaning that their message was kind of to tell attention to look how many homeless people there are. They're willing to sit out in the cold winter because they have other place to go. And that visual kind of narrative is something that they've been talking about, of course, but that's what he was trying to.
Yeah. You notice the cases he cites on symbolic speech. There are old friends, Tinker, the student armband case, symbolic speech, and Stromberg, raising the flag. And he admits that maintaining the parks in pristine, attractive condition is a significant government interest. He doesn't quarrel with that. And notice the difference between the type of interest that the time, place, and manner rules govern, and the type of interest that would be required, the government would be required to show if it was a content-based restriction. If it's content-based, the government has to show a compelling interest